to talk about someone known as Duncan the Wonder Horse. That's the NBC nickname that was affixed to Tom Brokaw, not just because in an eye blink, he went from local reporter to White House correspondent, to Today Show host, to NBC anchor, to best-selling author, to trout fisherman, and to an army of thousands of people who consider him, what'd you say, Tom? Who consider him one of their best friends. The nickname also stuck to Tom because on his own, he somehow found time to generously mentor several generations of NBC employees. Born in Webster, South Dakota, Tom went to public schools from kindergarten through college. What that history and his grounding in South Dakota produced was a man comfortable with himself. He calls his just-released bestseller A Lucky Life. But Brokaw wasn't just lucky. He was comfortable in his own skin, which helped make him a great mentor. He did not think that someone else's success subtracted from his own. 4 years after graduating from the University of South Dakota, he joined NBC's Los Angeles station, KMBC. He has served NBC ever since, and the network has served him. I will never forget that when Tom's father, Big Red, passed away, Tom was to host at his own home with Meredith a media dinner to welcome his new co-anchor, Roger Mudd. It was a dumb idea to pair two anchors, not that the ever-loyal Brokaw would subvert the plan. So after attending his dad's funeral, he raced back from South Dakota to make the persistently prickly Mudd comfortable. Being comfortable is not always something that is common among anchors, who often get into trouble because they are not grounded, as Tom is, are swelled by their fame, and thirst to be perceived as more than news readers. If you ask Tom who mentored him, he mentions a newspaper columnist and a television executive, Peter Lissagore and Dick Wald, who's sitting with us today. They were not particularly gentle with Tom. He describes Lissagore taking him under his wing during the biggest political story of all, Watergate, and in Tom's words, providing, quote, wise journalistic guidance while also keeping my ego in check. He spotted me at some big deal in Washington event where I had the spotlight. With a crooked little smile, he'd silently mouth, F you. As sometimes happens to TV stars, he thought Tom was too full of Tom. Brokaw's own tough love mentoring includes working with new talent like Richard Engel, now NBC's chief foreign correspondent. Engel remembers the risk Brokaw took in 2003, and I quote, on an unknown reporter, Tom wanted to help me develop. There was no chit-chat. For more than a decade, Tom kept asking me these big questions about the big stories and what we are missing at NBC. I think you can judge the success of a mentor, he went on to say, by how much you don't want to disappoint him. Nobody wants to disappoint Tom. Here's how Jane Pauley, who's also with us today, and by the way, I had to cut out for space reasons some of the other people who gave us eloquent testimony about Tom. Jane was his co-host on Today's Show and says that Tom could be both a Dutch uncle and a maddening older brother. His mentoring, she says, included Tom finding her first New York apartment, complete with furniture, by the way, and of course, a boyfriend who is now her husband. Mike Barnacle, columnist, MSNBC Morning Joe contributor, and longtime Brokaw friend, had an inside baseball view of Tom, the talent scout. It was the summer of 1984 at the Democratic National Convention, Barnacle says, and Brokaw had pulled together a softball game. While the game was on, Tom was deep in discussion with a young guy with several newspapers tucked under his arm. He had introduced himself to Tom only minutes before, but now the conversation made it seem as if they had grown up together. It was a conversation that would go on for the next 24 years, with Brokaw providing a guiding hand and always his friendship. The young guy's name was Tim Russert, and he, like so many others, was forever grateful for what he learned daily from Tom. It seems right to give the final word to two people, the the executive producer who worked most closely with Tom, and the network chief, who was and again is his ultimate boss. Quote, Tom's values are as deep as the rich black soil of his native North Dakota, says Bill Wheatley, his executive producer at Nightly. He comes from hardworking people who value straightforwardness, probity, and decency. As it happens, those are pretty good qualities for the making of an outstanding journalist. If you asked NBC News staffers who has been their most admired colleague, Tom would be their selection by a wide margin. You're nodding your head. Andy Lack, who's with us today, ran NBC News for 11 of the 21 years that Brokaw anchored the nightly news. And he returned as chairman this year. He puts it quite simply. Tom pushed you, including his president, to go the extra mile, go early, stay late, go prepared, never give up. Words to live by. He set a standard for us all. So, Duncan the Wonder Horse, come on up here and get your award.
Thank you, Ken, very much. I just make an observation. I'm always the working journalist. The other introducers all worked for a daily newspaper or in broadcasting, so their introductions were a lot more economical and efficient. Ken works for a weekly, The New Yorker, so anything less than 4,000 words is not acceptable to him. I want a point of personal privilege, if I can. Some of you know that I've been having some health issues in the last 9 months and beyond that. And one of my very closest friends, a man I admire so much, has been going through his own ordeal as well. But without speaking to each other about it, we both determined that we would go on with our lives. So would you give a very warm welcome to one of the greatest warriors in our business, my friend Roy Safer, who's sitting over here at this table tonight. This is a great honor. I love this organization. I served on the board. I think it is really the most important journalistic honoring organization that I know. I like to think that the Pulitzers try to think of themselves as the Livingston Awards in some way, because it is a ceremony of renewal, of seeing these young people come forward who are working, as you notice from your program now, in all these new forms of journalism. None here today came from what we would describe as a traditional form, and yet they're out there on the ragged edge, doing what this country expects of journalists, uncovering that which needs to be uncovered and providing their audiences with the information that they'll need to get through their lives. This is about mentoring. The fact is that from the moment I left South Dakota, I was mentored by very generous colleagues professionally, newspapermen and broadcasters as well, and I am the product of all of that. I couldn't possibly list all of them, but many of them are in this room today. Dick Wald of NBC News. I remember when he first came to me and said, they want you to do the Today Show. I said, I'm covering Watergate. I'm not leaving that to do the Today Show. He understood. He came to me a couple of years later and said, this time you don't have any choice. You really have to do the Today Show. I didn't have an agent at the time. And he said, you must get an agent. So I went to my office and picked up the phone and called the most notorious agent in America, a man by the name of Ed Hookstroughton, known affectionately and unaffectionately as the Hook. And 10 minutes later, Wald came running down the hallway saying, I didn't mean you should call the Hook. So in a way, that was very hopeful to me as well. There were others, of course, along the way. My great friend, Ben Bradley, that we lost. And as well, Tom Winship of the Boston Globe. One of my very favorite stories about Tom Winship as a mentor was when my dear friend Curtis Wilkie, a son of the South, worked his way north, now became the ace political reporter in very short order at the Boston Globe. He turned in a sparkling story, hitting it out of the box. Winship, that great patrician nor'easter, came over to Curtis Wilkie, looked at him and said, I like the cut of your jib. And as Wilkie later described that encounter, he said, I had to go to the dictionary and find out what jib means, actually. So those are the moments that really keep us involved in this profession and keep us as well, for those of us who have survived long enough, as mentors. There's a conceit, I think, about editors and anchormen and managing editors that the people who work for us will listen to us because they have to. But the fact is that mentoring really is a two-way street. If you have a certain amount of seniority and authority, you're trying to share that with your colleagues who may be a little bit younger. But the best form of mentoring is when it becomes a two-way exchange. And I always try to encourage that environment at NBC News. And I must say that it worked very well. For example, I tried to mentor Campbell Brown, but she almost never took my advice, but she did very well. The others in the 2:30 meeting would push back. And between us, we would find what we thought was the important part of the news of the day and get it done. And I would walk away feeling proud of these people with whom I worked. Other mentors, even at this age for me, are the younger winners of this award in prior times. I'm mentoring every week that I read The New Yorker, edited by David Remnick. I'm mentoring in another way by reading the work of Tom Friedman. In the world of history and literature, I'm also mentored by Doris Kearns Goodwin every time she turns out a great book. So mentoring is not just I talk, you listen. It really is an exchange between colleagues about what's the best thing that we can do today to fulfill the obligation and the promise of journalism. And I think that we all have to think more carefully about that now in this vast, exploding universe in which so many people claim that they're journalists when they're not necessarily journalists, or when they're not doing the work of what we consider to be important journalism. And we have to think about that as well. And that's why this ceremony and this occasion is so important, because we do celebrate those who, without the resources, as Ellen said, that the rest of us in mainstream journalism have. And we need to remind them that we're there behind them, and the audience can be served, and they are doing what they need to be thinking about, all of us. Finally, I want to mention two mentors that I had that were critically important to me. One was my mother. She graduated from high school at the age of 16, in the middle of the Dust Bowl in South Dakota. The family had lost the farm. College cost $100 a year. There was no way that she could go to school and study journalism. She did the next best thing. She married my father, Red, a very ambitious and hardworking construction worker. They moved around a lot, and she became the assistant postmistress in a small town on the Missouri River. And if you want to be the managing editor of a town, you become the assistant postmistress. And every night she would come home and sit me down when I was 10 and 11 and 12 years old and talk to me about what she'd heard that day. Just two examples. The day that Stalin died, a Russian emigre walked up to Mother's window and said, "They're stoking it up down below today." I've always thought that would be the perfect New York Post headline, quite honestly. The other one was on the morning after a kind of raucous Halloween in town. One of our very favorite grown-ups was a man by the name of Gordon Larson. He fixed your furnace, and he was around working weekends because the family needed extra money at the gas station. He came in and uncharacteristically began to complain about the behavior of the high school kids the night before. My mother said, "Oh, come on, Gordon. What were you doing when you were 17? And he looked at her and he said, "I was landing on Guadalcanal." That stuck with me. And when I wrote The Greatest Generation, we tracked him down and found him. And he said to me, "I can't believe your mother remembered that. It was the only time I ever talked about the war." I had called him and asked him to call me back. And so we're on the phone, and after about 5 minutes, there's this long pause. And I said, "Gordon, are you okay?" And he said, "Yes, I just realized, however, I'm paying for this damn phone call." I said, "Hang up and I'll call you back." The other mentor in my life, who so many of you know, who is with us here today, is Meredith. She's not only been an extraordinarily important personal mentor, but a professional mentor as well. In the course of our 3 years of marriage, I could count on her to give me the best possible advice about when to go forward, when to pause, when to not get too excited about something. When I would come home at night puffed up about something that I had done, or in a fit of some depression because of the way I had been treated by someone. I was always pleased when Meredith remembered what it was that I did for a living. It just wasn't that important. What was important is how our family went through life. What was important about her was to be in the mothership, to steer a steady course, and let the rest of us go off from that mothership and do what we loved, our 3 daughters and me. And frankly, I wouldn't be standing here today without her. Before you get carried away, she's not perfect. When I was writing my first book, she said to me, "Greatest Generation as a title? I don't think so." Thank you all very much. I really love you.